Okay. So again, we're learning about organizational structures. How do you establish the different departments or divisions within your organization, and how many levels of hierarchy you should have, right? That's really what this is all about. So we looked at just a very basic, pyramid sort of structure that most organizations use. We looked at a more complicated structure like Hartnell's. But then we talked about the 5 traditional structures. Okay, I'm going to hide that for a second. What were any of those 5 traditional organizational structures that we learned about? Think. What were any of those 5? What are common ways that companies divide up their different departments? HR. Okay, so by functional area like HR, engineering, marketing, etc. That would be one way to do it. How else? You're too close to spring break, right? Too nice outside, hard to concentrate. So functional area was one. By product was another. Triggering any memory. Geographical area.
It's dependent.
What's that?
It's dependent the business you have to.
Yeah, it depends on the business you have. Process and customer. Those were 5 different traditional ways you might divide up your organization. Right? Sound familiar? So again, functional, product, process, customer, geographic. We talked about the difference between line and staff positions. Which is the one that's more directly involved with making or selling the product? Line or staff? Line. Thank you, Jade. That's right. Line positions are more directly involved. Think of it like people on the assembly line making the product. Whereas staff positions are support. They're not making the product, they're not selling the product, they're just supporting other people in the organization. Not that that's that's a necessary thing too, it's just not as direct. We talked about the division of labor, which is when you figure out that, what jobs need to be done, right? You divide up all the work into different tasks so that you can have people specialize in certain tasks and it's more efficient. That's all right. Then we got into some contemporary organizational structures, like the matrix, right? The matrix structure. How many bosses do you have? Multiple. 2, basically 2 bosses, right? You have a boss for your functional area, like we see here. You also have a boss for whatever project or product you're working on, right? And then you have to kind of intermediate, be a liaison between the 2 and try to work things out so everybody's happy. We talked about the role of committees. We saw an example of that in the Zappos video, how there was a group of people working together, sharing information and ideas. And that's how committees function. They come together with a particular purpose in mind. Maybe it's a temporary thing, like once they solve the problem or make the decisions and they're done, or sometimes it's an ongoing thing and the committee just keeps going and going and going. There are benefits to making decisions as a group. What were some of the benefits of group decision making?
Different perspectives.
Okay, great. You're getting different perspectives, so you might come up with ideas or solutions you would not otherwise have come up with. What's the downside to group decision making? Takes longer. Exactly. Right? Takes longer, it takes effort. You have to get people together, or maybe you could do it online in some cases, like by email, but that's not ideal. It's better if everybody's communicating at the same time and sharing ideas, bouncing ideas off each other, and that does take time. But for important decisions, it's worth it, right? Unless it's an urgent thing that has to be decided right now, probably worth it to spend the time getting input from others and making a decision. You know, in your personal life, when you've got important decisions to make, ultimately they're your decision because it's your life, right? But by involving others, maybe family members, maybe friends, maybe coworkers, or whomever, you'll get different ideas and probably come to a better decision, right? This ties into an important concept we haven't really talked about too much. We talked about efficiency versus effectiveness. We talked about quality versus quantity in a previous chapter, the leadership chapter. But there's a similar concept that's relevant here, which is urgency versus importance. When you're in the workplace, there are some things that are urgent, that have to be done quickly, but they're not necessarily always important. So sometimes, if we're so focused on doing the things that are urgent and have to be done now, we lose sight of the important things that also need to be done. In fact, maybe those should have higher priority. For example, Snapchat. Does anybody still use Snapchat? I know it was really popular at one point. Anybody on Snapchat? Yeah, okay, some people. Do the messages still disappear? I think they changed it so that some messages stick around and some, I mean, I've never used it, but yeah. Okay. But anyways, the original idea of Snapchat was messages are there, but only for a short period of time, and then they disappear, which gives us an urgency, right? Or like, I guess it would be the same thing if somebody's doing their stories. I mean, forgive me, I don't spend a whole lot of time on social media. But there's some things online that are urgent, where if you're not there at that time, you kind of miss it. But is it really important, right? Is it more important than taking your exam or spending time with your family or other things that perhaps are really just more important things to do? So we need to separate urgency and importance. Nicole, I didn't notice, did you put your name on the list? Okay, great. And in the workplace, this happens all the time. If your phone rings, there's an urgency, because if you don't pick it up, it'll go to voicemail, or maybe I'll just hang up. You don't know if that's an important call or not, right? Maybe if you see who's calling and you see, oh, you know, that's my boyfriend or girlfriend just calling to chat. Well, maybe it's not that important and I won't pick it up, right? But if you see it's your boss calling and your boss only calls you when it's something important, then you know, well, I better pick it up. Just because it's urgent doesn't necessarily mean it's important. And sometimes we have to, if we want to be effective in whatever we're doing in our lives, we have to sometimes ignore the urgent things so we can focus on the important things. And that, from my experience, that's not always easy to do, and it takes really practice to get there. But it ties in here because that group decision making can lead to better results, and that's important. But it takes time, and so sometimes we don't do it because we've got these other deadlines, or we don't want to spend the time, right? So it's a constant thing we have to think about. All right. Any questions or comments? Harrison.
But something could be urgent and important.
That's true. If something is urgent and important, then you definitely want to prioritize it. Exactly. In fact, I was just in a hiring committee yesterday. We were interviewing a couple people. And that was one of the questions we were asking them. How do you prioritize your work? And I don't think either of them used that terminology, but if either of them had said, well, I figure out what's important and make sure that gets done, but they focused more on what was urgent. Not taking into consideration that some of those urgent things maybe are less important, right? So something to think about. If you ever read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Dr. Stephen Covey, you read it?
I want to read a book.
Yeah. Has anybody read it?
No, yeah.
So I read it back when I was working at AT&T. Not sure how I got introduced to the book initially, but it's one of the most popular books about success in your career. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Dr. Covey had done some research about what he felt were the 7 things that made effective people effective. And that's what the whole book is about. And that was one of the things that he talked about was to put first things first. Prioritize things, meaning what's most important, get that done. And differentiated between urgency and importance. So I've been trying to get better at that since the 90s when I first read that book. By the way, I ended up reading it 4 times because that's how good of a book I felt it was. And it's a process. I can't say that I have perfected it. But it's something to be aware of. Think about what's really important, make sure you're doing that. Even if that means not spending an hour and a half on TikTok, right? Which is maybe not important unsportsmanlike conduct. Maybe TikTok is important, you know. But my guess is for most of us, it's not the most important thing in the world. Maybe fun, right? For some people, they make a living on TikTok. But is it really important? Is it really helping you become who you could be, helping you self-actualize? I don't know. All right. And then we talked about work teams and work groups, how a team has a specific objective that they're working towards, right? Whereas a group could be just any collection of workers without necessarily having a common goal. Different types of teams. I think, did we run out of time? I think,
Yeah, we don't.
did we talk about what makes a team high performing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, well then refresh my memory. What makes a team a high performing team? Efficiency, okay. We get things done without much waste, but what else? Cooperation, okay, good point. Okay, so they are working towards the same goal. If your team has somebody on it that has their own hidden agenda that they're trying to accomplish that's different from the team's, it's going to create a problem, right? That dilutes the energy instead of all being focused like, you know, like a laser. Some of the energy is going in a different place. But yeah, keeping focused on that goal. Jaden, I think you said cooperation, right? Same concept, everybody working together. What else makes a high performing team? Diversity, yeah. And diverse talents and perspectives. You think skills are helpful for whatever they're trying to do?
I was gonna say, similar work ethic.
Okay, similar work ethic. Yeah, if you share some similar values and beliefs about what you're doing and why you're doing it, that would definitely be helpful. Having some experience, right? If everybody's brand new to whatever they're doing, they might not be as high performing as if you've got some people there with some experience. Knowledge, having knowledge, all of that works together, right? Think about Some great teams. Can somebody give me some examples? What are some great teams you could think of? Maybe from sports, maybe from music, or any other.
Baseball Giants.
The Giants, okay? What makes the Giants a great team?
They got Matt Chapman, Jorge Soler.
Okay, so some of the individuals on the team, and what is it about them? I have no idea.
They signed
Who they are.
contracts.
They sign contracts, but what is it about? What do they bring to the team that helps the team? Their skills? Okay. Are these like arrogant kind of players that they're so good they don't feel like they need anybody, or are they more of a team player? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just asking. I'm guessing if the team is effective, then even these superstar players have a team mentality, right? It's probably not all about them. It's about how do we win together, which takes some humility. All right, so those are some of the things that go into a high-performing team. Any comments, any questions at this point? All right, well, let's talk about some of the tools that organizations can use to develop relationships, because really that's what this whole chapter is about. Maybe I can't change the textbook, but maybe I should refer to the chapter not about organizational structures, but relationship. That's really what we're talking about, right? The structure is the relationships between the different departments and the different people at different levels. So one way to influence those relationships within the organization is whether your structure is flat or tall. Okay? And this can apply to any organizational structure. If you have few levels of management, like we see here, then it's a very flat structure. But if you have a lot of levels of management, like here we've got president, director, regional manager, local manager, we have 4 levels there of management. That's a taller structure. And some organizations might have 10 or 15 levels of management, from the worker to whoever's at the top. What are the advantages, do you think, of having a flat structure like this? Kind of like Zappos, right? Where they don't have managers. What's the advantage there?
To listen to more people's point of views.
Okay. You got more people involved with making decisions. Okay, what else? How do you think these salespeople would feel here? They report to the sales manager. That sales manager is not going to be able to micromanage all these people, right? They're not going to be able to spend a lot of time with each employee, which gives the employees a lot of freedom, autonomy, empowerment. They can probably make more decisions on their own. As opposed to if you get a structure like this that's a lot taller, you've got all this bureaucracy, right? So you're this person, you want a major change made in the organization, well, look at all these different levels you'd have to go up to try to convince the organization to make a change. It's almost impossible. But what would be some advantages of having this kind of structure? Why are there some companies that have such tall structures and so many layers of management?
Because there are big companies.
Is there big companies?
That probably regional, national company, yes. So they have regional because it's part of the country, and the other is only focused like a simple store.
Mhm.
You don't have a lot of personal.
Yeah, the bigger the company, the more people you need to manage, right? And if you had a flat structure like this with, 100 people reporting to one person, that's probably not that manageable. A couple people asked, or in their video discussion activity, about could Amazon, which is the parent company of Zappos, could Amazon operate in the same way Zappos does?
Mm.
And probably not. I think it's probably too big of an organization. They could, to some degree, they could adapt or adopt some of the principles. But because they have so many customers, so many employees, so many suppliers, it would probably be too chaotic if they tried to be as open and flexible as Zappos. So it is normal in a larger organization, you get more levels of management because then you have more control. In a smaller organization, you can, kind of maintain control. Like at Zappos, they're headquartered in one, in Las Vegas, in one place. And the CEO can kind of walk around and see what's happening. But when you've got a company spread out all over the globe, you can't do that, right? So to keep things in control, you need to put people in charge, and then those people need other people in charge, and you end up with this taller kind of hierarchy. So there is no right or wrong here. This is just one way to understand how you can influence these relationships. Now, the next concept, you make sure I'm remembering. Yeah, the next concept deals directly with this one. It's called span of control. If you have a flat structure like this one, see how this manager has a lot of people, like, what is that, 7? Yeah, 7 people reporting to them. That's a decent sized group. Typically, managers don't have more than 10 to 15 direct reports, people reporting directly to them, because it's really harder to oversee the work of more than about 10 people. You can, but then you have to, you have less and less time with each one. So teams typically have, up to about 10 people reporting to one boss. So that's a good size group there. And so this manager has what's called a wide span of control. They've got a large number of people that they're responsible for directly. Now, in this taller structure, notice that the president has only 3 direct reports. This director of sales has only 2 people reporting to them. This sales manager has only 2 people reporting to them. This person has only 2. So now, with this larger structure, you can have a more narrow span of control. That makes it easier for the manager. They've only got a few people that they need to pay attention to and keep track of and make sure that they're doing a good job. It's a lot easier to manage 2 people than 7 people. However, there's a downside. What do you think would be, well, in fact, let me go to the next slide here, because here we can see a narrow span of control, like in the tall organization, and then a wide span of control here, right, like in the flat organization. Obviously, employees will get more guidance, more time with their manager. No, you don't always want to spend time with your manager, but if you're really trying to improve and you're really trying to work hard for the company, having that feedback from a good manager is really valuable. So for the employee, as long as it's a good manager, it's good to be a part of a small span of control. What's the problem though? Again, a narrow span of control goes together with a tall organizational structure, right? What's the problem for the organization in having such a tall organizational structure and such a narrow span of control? Yeah.
Could like one of the things be like there could be like miscommunication or misinformation?
Okay.
Is it like just a lack of like constant like checkup system because it's
Okay.
more like narrow.
Well, so there, there can be more issues. So let's look at that. So if this sales manager wants to communicate something to their team, they can call a meeting, they can send an email, and it's covered, right? But if this president wants to communicate something into these three, then it has to get communicated down to the next level, then it gets cascaded down to the next level, and sometimes things get lost in the process. So yes, in a large, complex organization like that, sometimes communication really suffers. So that's a valid point. What else? Why else might this tall structure be problematic in an organization? Are these managers working for free?
Mhm.
Managers are expensive, right? They tend to make more than the workers. So now you've got all these managers in here, not making the product, not selling the product, just managing. And you're having to pay for all these people, right? It's expensive. So that's why a lot of times when organizations are having financial difficulty, what they do is they say, okay, we're just going to take out a layer of management and shift those job responsibilities to, to these managers, and that's going to save us some money. Right? And basically they're making their organization a little flatter by doing that. Okay. So that's probably a good place to pause here. Any questions or comments before we go on to our grow activity? No. All right. Well, let's do that then. So get in your groups. Take 10 minutes. Do the activity.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Another tool for relationships within an organization is chain of command. That's a fairly common phrase. You might have heard it before. I'm sure you're familiar with it from your time in the military. So what is chain of command? What does it mean?
It's like different.
Okay. Okay. Exactly. Different stages of leadership. So if you have an issue, if you're Homer Simpson here, and you have an idea, problem, anything that you need some support on, you can go to your boss, right? And that's going up the chain of command. I'm not a regular Simpsons watcher. I remember it like when it first started. Before it was even its own show, it was part of the Tracy Ullman show back in the 80s.
Yeah.
You remember that? I don't think, were you born?
I wasn't born.
Yeah, okay. Maybe you saw some reruns. But that's what I remember about The Simpsons. I don't know all the characters and everything. But apparently, does Homer report to a bar of radioactive material or something? Nobody knows.
Pizza truck.
A chalk, I don't know. But anyways, let's just say that's his boss, right? So if he has an issue or an idea, he can go to his boss. And if his boss can't resolve it and needs support, they can go to their boss and up to their boss, and it goes up the chain of command, right? Like it's a chain all the way from the bottom to the top. I guess there's a canary at the top of the chain. And decisions can also flow down the chain of command, right? If the supreme boss up there, whoever's the leader at the top, makes a decision, that information, will filter down through the organization. Because the person at the top doesn't have time to meet with everybody directly, right? Or to communicate directly. They could send out maybe a mass email. But if, let's say there was an important thing happening in the organization and everybody needed to attend some meetings to find out that the company was getting purchased or was relocating to another state, something major like that. Well, the person at the top would probably meet with their direct team. And then those, like this guy would meet with his team. Exactly. And that person would meet with the people under them. And so it cascades down through the organization, through the chain of command. Is it ever appropriate to go outside of your chain of command? So would it be appropriate for Homer, for example, to go talk to this person and make a complaint? In most organizations, that's considered inappropriate, because then you're leaving your boss out of the loop. In some organizations, though, they say we've got an open door policy, and that might mean it's okay to go talk to whoever you want about whatever you want. How did it work in the military?
You get into trouble.
You get in
Every time.
trouble if you went out of the chain of command.
Yeah.
So if you had an issue, talk to your direct superior, right?
Even if they're not conveying the message, you still have to go through them.
Okay.
Yep.
Because they want all the information to flow very directly, top to bottom, not to be spreading out all kinds of other parts of the organization, which creates, can create some issues. So it really just depends on the culture of the organization, but that's the concept. Chain of command keeps that information flow and that decision-making very narrow. Let's say there's something going on at your work that maybe you think is not only wrong, but illegal. And let's say your boss is involved. Then what do you do? Would it be appropriate to break the chain of command and maybe go over their head to their boss? Okay. You could definitely do that. I mean, that doesn't mean that that boss is gonna receive that information well, because maybe they're in on it too, right? Or maybe they just don't want to hear about it, or maybe they don't believe you. So what else could you do? You've got strong belief that there's something illegal going on that your boss is involved in. You could blow the whistle. Okay? What's that?
That's it, blackmail.
Blackmail, you could blackmail. I didn't think about that. Okay, interesting point. You probably could. But you could blow the whistle. What does that mean? Yeah, okay. Then, yeah, you could notify some authority, right? Some law enforcement or the media, somebody with power that could put pressure on the company and get it fixed. Now, when you do that, there's a good chance you're going to get retaliated against, maybe even fired by your employer, right? So you might want to have another job lined up, right? Before you blow the whistle. If it's a tax issue, if your company is cheating on income taxes and you blow the whistle to the IRS, you get some of the money that the company owes to the IRS. They give you a certain percentage of it.
We didn't do that.
There's a financial
We
side,
don't
yeah.
know that.
Um,
But that's
other than blowing the whistle, what else could you do? Okay, you could just leave. Is there any place else in the organization for those sorts of concerns to be voiced? Christina? What'd you say? The union. Okay, if you are a union employee, you can file a grievance. Yeah, you can do that. And then the union will probably take action, especially if it has anything to do with the union's contract. If it's outside of the union's contract, they might say that they can't really do anything except support you if you do blow the whistle. I'm not really sure how that would work. But yeah, you could go to the union. Who else? Where else could you go? HR, who said that? Yeah, Jocelyn's right. You could go to human resources and maybe they'll have your back. Or maybe not. Depends. Some human resources departments are pro-employee, but ultimately they answer to the company, right? HR is really there to protect the company. they might or might not have your back. Those are pretty much your options, I would say. Can't really think of anything else. Lawyer? Yeah. You might want to retain a lawyer if you're going to be blowing the whistle or if you're planning to sue the company. Yeah. So there are options where you could go outside the chain of command, but in some organizations, you know, it could get very interesting very quickly if you do that. All right, let's talk about centralization versus decentralization. And you might remember it did come up last week talking about information systems. You can keep your data centralized where a few people have access to it, or you can decentralize and give more people access to the data. Well, same thing with decision-making in an organization. And I found this interesting graphic, I think it's interesting at least, hopefully you agree, that shows over time how societies have gone from fairly centralized to very decentralized. And we could think in terms of businesses, in terms of communities, the same phenomenon has evolved over time. So you go back way back in time, say 10,000 years, when we didn't have cities even, we didn't have farms. People just kind of migrated around, you know, picking berries, chasing animals, and that's how they found food, right? So they were hunter-gatherers. And they basically lived in these clans, these small, you know, kind of family units that would just travel around. And then it was usually a leader. I mean, I'm no expert here, but I think most of these clans had a leader. So they were, that leader basically was the central point of power. Right? Whatever they decided basically was what the clan did. But then over time, we start to settle down and raise animals and raise, you know, crops and form cities. And now more complex structures start to evolve, right? So maybe you've got a king, and then you've got all these different lords that report to the king, and each of those lords has their subjects. Or maybe you've got a tribe, you know, you've got the tribal chief, and then all these different clans that have chiefs within the tribe, and then you've got the other clan members. Clan with a C, not clan with a K. And then we, you know, evolve, you could say. The Industrial Revolution comes along and we start to build factories and a lot more technology and mass production. We get these large organizations. If you think of some of the really wealthy people from the turn of the, what would that have been? The 1800s to the 1900s. There were the Gettys, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, all these really powerful, wealthy families in the United States that controlled multiple corporations. And those corporations, you know, then have different subsidiaries, which, you know, each one has its own CEO, which then has hundreds of thousands of employees. So you end up with this really large organization that's really an organization of organizations. So now you've had to decentralize some of that decision-making out to these sub-organizations. And now in more modern times, we get much more complex structures. Let's think about Amazon as a company. What did they start as? What did Amazon do initially when they first got started?
They sold books.
Books. Yeah, it was an online bookstore, right? That's all they sold was books. But the internet was growing. They came up with these algorithms to recommend what books you would probably be interested in. That was like some early artificial intelligence stuff going on, where they say, oh, you bought this book? You'll probably be interested in this book. And by doing that, they sold more books. And people found that they could find the books that they wanted through Amazon instead of having to run around town going to different bookstores. And then, of course, they branched into different products. and services. And now they've got their web services, they've got their autonomous car company that my son works for. They've got Zappos, they've got all these, they've got spaceships, right? That what is, I forgot, Bezos's spaceship company, what it's called. But anyways, they've got all these other companies that are either, direct subsidiaries or somehow affiliated with Amazon. So it's a much more complex structure, right? If you think of Jeff Bezos, the founder, and by the way, I think he started the company with about $100,000 investment or something like that, which is a lot of money. But considering that he's now, I think he's the richest person in the world right now. I think he surpassed Elon Musk just recently.
He's pulled a bunch of money out, that's for sure.
Well, that's true. Yeah, sometimes he sells off some of the stock, but he's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Even though he and his wife divorced a few years back, and she got, something like half of his billions, he's still the richest man in the world. And by the way, she, Mackenzie Scott, I think is her name. Anybody know? She gives away millions, actually billions of dollars to all kinds of different charitable causes. So she seems to be a pretty interesting person. But anyways, just thinking about Amazon and the way that they're structured with Bezos at the top, all these different companies he's running, each of them having their own subsidiaries, and the relationships between these different organizations, it's a very complex structure, right? He can't be in control of everything all the time. So he's had to decentralize a lot of that decision-making to other people. And then you get to something like Bitcoin, which I think we talked about that a little bit last week too, right? That is a completely decentralized system. Typically, organizations keep their data on servers, right? And then everybody accesses those servers. But with Bitcoin, the servers are computers that are just scattered all over the world, where individual people say, I want to get into Bitcoin mining, and then they just join the network with their computer. And there's nobody in charge. There are no employees at Bitcoin. There is no building. There is no organization. As an entity, there's no corporation. There's no partnership. It's just algorithms running on computers all over the world that nobody can control. It's a completely decentralized organization. You can own some Bitcoin if you want. You've got $60,000 to buy a Bitcoin, or you can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. But you can't buy stock because there is no stock. It's not a corporation.
By ETFs now.
ETFs that own cryptocurrency, that's true. That's true. But then you're owning the currency. It's not stock in the company because there is no company. So it's a completely decentralized system, which really raises some questions about what is the future of organizational structures. For example, right now, let's say you drive a car, right? By law, you have to have some liability insurance on that car, so that if you cause an accident, there's some money that the insurance company will pay, assuming it's covered in the policy, and you have to have that insurance. Well, how does insurance work? All the people that have that insurance pay in money, and then when they file a claim, if that claim is approved, then the company pays that claim, right? That's how insurance works. Using this sort of decentralized system like Bitcoin, you could have an insurance program with no company, where the system's just automated. You pay into it, there's a claim, it automatically pays out. You don't need any employees. You don't need investors. This opens up a whole new possibility. Where in the future, insurance companies might not be companies. It might be crypto. I don't know. But it changes the way we think about organizations. They don't necessarily have to even have people anymore. So, questions or comments? All right. Well, here's another way we can think about organizations. Most of the organizations we're familiar with fall into this mechanistic category where they operate like a machine. So imagine, I don't know if you've ever opened up the hood of a regular gas combustion sort of car, but you see all these different parts, and each part is doing something different, but they all work together to make the car go, right? The machine. And that's how most organizations are structured. You've got a very traditional kind of hierarchy, one of those 5 structures that we saw before. You've got very formal rules, communication flows up and down the chain of command, and decision-making is highly structured. It's clear who gets to make which decisions. Everything is running like a machine in a large corporation that is well managed. But compare that with Zappos or other organizations that are more creative, where maybe they don't have such a rigid organization. Like I probably mentioned to you this other company, W.L. Gore and Associates. When they hire you, you don't apply for a specific job. You just apply to work there. And then when they hire you, you get to figure out what job you're going to do. It's up to you to decide what your job is. That's not rigid at all, right? That's completely loose and flexible. So in these organic organizations, there's a lot of flexibility, very few rules. Communication is not just up and down the chain of command, but you can communicate with whomever you feel you need to communicate with. They have an open door policy. And then decision-making tends to be more participatory, like we saw in Zappos, where they were having a conversation as a team instead of a boss telling them what to do. So as you see, the organic approach to organizational structure is very different from what we're used to. It's easier to implement in a small organization. It's harder in a large company like a Zappos or but it's possible. Both of those examples are multi-billion-dollar companies that are very successful, yet they have a fairly organic structure. So I think of the organic structure being kind of more like a garden. You just have to put, certain things in place, but then it kind of grows on its own. As long as it's getting the water and the nutrients, things kind of grow, right? And you might end up with some weeds. That's okay, that's part of the process, right? You then address that issue when it arises. All right, questions about the difference between a mechanistic and an organic organization? I think it's interesting, the word organic and the word organization both have the same root, right? Organ. Okay, then we get to the informal organization. That arises on its own. At the workplace, you might be assigned to a certain work team, you might have a certain boss, but you get to decide who you chat with during lunch, or while you're working, or outside of work, or over text, right? You get to have some social interaction to some degree at work and outside of work. And you share information. That is the informal structure. Management doesn't control this. It just kind of happens on its own. It can be good if what people are talking about is positive, but if they're spreading rumors or venting, about work, then it can have a negative impact, right? Because that negativity can kind of spread. So as a manager, since you can't control the informal organization, how can you influence it? What can you do to try to make sure that when employees are chit-chatting with each other, that they're doing it in a positive way, not a negative way?
Contract.
That- What could you do?
You can do in your contract, you can spread information, certain information.
You could spread
But
information.
you can, when you sign a contract, you say, you're gonna spread any information.
Oh, tell them you
Yeah,
cannot,
yes,
okay.
yeah.
So there are companies that might have you sign a non-disclosure agreement, so you can't share company secrets. Or you might have policies where you can't tell other people how much you make, right? You could put some rules in place like that. There's something else. Let's see. It'll come back to me. Yeah, so those are some things you could do. But it's hard to enforce,
Mhm.
right? Jaden?
So, you could probably.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay. Yeah, you can create opportunities for people to talk informally, right? And hey, if you're bringing in lunch, that tends to put people in a better mood, right? If you're giving them time away from their normal tasks to socialize, they tend to appreciate that, so they're more likely to be positive. But what else can you do to try to keep the informal structure positive? You think if you treat your employees well, they're gonna have more nice things to say as opposed to bad
Yeah.
things, right? Pay them well, listen to their concerns, share information that's relevant to them, right? If you hear there's a rumor going around, put out the facts, try to clarify things. These are things as management you can do to try to, avoid some of that negativity that spreads like wildfire. The more positive the culture that you create, the less it's going to be a problem. There's one tech company, I think it was Facebook, where employees could eat for free. So they'd go to the cafeteria and they'd have to wait in line to get their food. And, and the company told the kitchen to slow things down a little bit so that people would stand in line longer, because they wanted the people to talk to each other. They wanted that line to be slow. And most companies, they'd be saying, no, speed it up. We got to get these people back to work. In this case, they were saying, no, we want them to have conversations. We think that that's good because they share information. They feel more like they're part of a community, right? So they were fostering the informal organization. Okay. Questions, comments? Oh, I know what the other thing was. I remember. Some organizations have a policy that you cannot gossip, which I think is interesting, right? Because what is gossip? Gossip is talking about other people. I guess it could be positive gossip, but generally it's kind of negative, right? It's like, did you hear what this person said to that person? Or who's dating who? And I could see a benefit by saying, hey, we don't do that here. You don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. I've only heard of a couple organizations that have that sort of a policy. So I've never worked someplace like that, but that's kind of my own policy. I don't believe in talking about people behind their backs. So I think I would actually find that refreshing to be in a culture where people don't say negative things. That doesn't mean you can't, have honest, hard conversations, but you don't backstab people. Now, to me, I would actually, I think, find that enjoyable. To not backstab, just to clarify.
When I was in Germany,
The worker cannot speak about their salary, how much the
Okay,
owner pay them.
Yeah.
They cannot speak about it.
right. That's very common. A lot of corporations here and large companies have a policy that you're not supposed to say how much you
Yeah,
earn.
because it's gonna be like trouble.
Yeah, whereas there are other organizations, like in the military and any government work, where it's public information. You can look it up, you know, if you wanted to know how much I get paid, it's out there on the internet. Or I can tell you, I guess, since it's public. But yeah, some organizations say, no, you can't talk about that. Okay, a couple final concepts and we'll do our matching activity. Can somebody tell me what this is, a virtual corporation? If you don't guess, because if you're guessing, you're probably gonna be wrong. So does anybody know what a virtual corporation is? Well, because it sounds like it's something to do with the internet, right? Virtual.
The picture right there is Sean
Yeah, well, it could be, it could be. Okay, so virtual corporation is when you decide to outsource major functions of your organization instead of doing them in-house. So let's say you start a company that you're really good at, I don't know, making t-shirts. So you design, you manufacture these t-shirts, but you're not really good at marketing. You're not really good at doing the accounting. You're not really good at doing the human resources parts. So you hire other companies to do that for you. Now you have this group of companies supporting you to help your corporation. That's a virtual corporation.
Like when people outsource to other countries for like phone calls, would that count?
It does, it does. Now, it's normal to do some outsourcing, but when you're outsourcing, I would say the majority
Like
of the
different
functions,
departments, like every
yeah, then you're in the category of a virtual corporation, right? Because these companies are coming together to create what normally would all be one company. Then there's the concept gig economy. Can somebody tell me what that means?
Job base. Like individual jobs, like, for example, one person's an accountant, right?
Not quite.
They did the job as an accountant? No.
It,
Like someone could be hired to paint his room, and that would be considered a gig,
okay.
just for like one time.
Yeah, it really has to do with their employment status. So like in Aaron's example, if somebody's being hired to paint this room, but they're not hired as an employee, they're hired as an independent contractor, then they don't get the benefits of being an employee. They're basically running their own business. They'll get paid for painting, but they're not an employee. So we find this, for example, in most states, if you drive for Uber or you drive for Lyft, you're not considered an employee. You're an independent contractor. And that's considered the gig economy. It's like you have a gig, you have an opportunity to make some money, but not as an employee. So you don't get some of the benefits and protections that employees have. So companies like that, because it's cheaper for them, easier for them to just stop working with you. They don't have to fire you. They just say, we're not going to work with you anymore. But it's generally not as good for the worker because, again, they don't have the rights and benefits. And then imagine with all the talk we've had about organizational structures, right? Whatever structure you set up, imagine now your company's merging with another company that has its own structure. So now you're going to have to somehow, mold your two structures into one. Okay, so with our remaining, 3 minutes. Yeah.
2.5.
Okay, I'm just gonna walk us through this because, again, I talked too much. Traditional forms of organizational structure. We see in the top right corner a fairly traditional structure. This one, basically by product, but you also see some functional areas over here. One interesting thing, though, is notice that each of these different product divisions has its own research and development, its own manufacturing, its own finance. So you get some duplication of efforts. And if you're going to have that kind of a structure, you really want those like those marketing departments should all work together instead of competing with each other. Okay, let's see what else we have. Contemporary structures would include the matrix structure like we see up on top. Teams, we can see this structure seems to have a lot of teams and committees and so forth going on. Over here, we talked about the span of control, how many workers you have reporting to you, right? We also talked about centralization versus decentralization. We talked about the informal structure that evolves by itself, mechanistic versus organic. And then some of the trends in organizational structure would be things like using independent contractors, gig workers, having people do remote work or telecommuting, outsourcing to other companies, letting people work flexible schedules, and then, having outsourcing to other countries as well. All right, so that's it. Have a good week. Good luck on your midterm, everybody. See you on Tuesday.
Thank you, teacher.
See you next week.
Bye, Andrea. Andrea.
Yeah, bye.